HOA Stories Part 1, The Rockslide Revenge. Picture this. You step onto your back deck on a foggy October morning in 2024, coffee mug warming your hands, and where there used to be a magnificent granite outcrop that stood guard over your property since the last ice age. There's nothing but torn earth and the acrid smell of dynamite residue hanging in the mountain air. The sound of industrial excavators ripping into ancient stone fills the valley where birdsong used to echo. That's for aesthetic improvement. HOA President Barbara Wellington announces from her pearl-white Range Rover, designer sunglasses reflecting the destruction. What this former interior designer didn't know. I'm a retired seismic engineer who spent 35 years studying how mountains stay standing, and she just removed the only thing keeping her million-dollar hillside mansion from sliding into the ravine below. Fast forward 8 months. Barbara's pristine home is tilting at a 5-degree angle, foundation cracking like a dropped egg, massive fissures zigzagging through her imported marble floors, while my modest cabin sits perfectly level on solid bedrock. The county inspector is marking her property condemned. Insurance companies are denying claims, and that rock formation she was so proud of demolishing, it's about to cost her everything she owns. What would you do if your HOA destroyed geological stability to satisfy aesthetic preferences? Where are you watching from? Bet your neighbors have attempted something this reckless, too. My name's Victor Reeves, 62 years old. And until 8 months ago, I thought the biggest challenge in retirement would be deciding which classic rock albums to play while refinishing the antique furniture I collect from estate sales. Turns out, I was wrong. The real challenge was an HOA board president who confused a degree in interior design with expertise in geological engineering. I inherited my uncle's Foraker Mountain property in what used to be wilderness territory back when Summit Ridge was nothing but logging roads, and the only HOA anybody knew about was completely fictional. My uncle Marcus Reeves was a forest ranger who survived Korea and came home to build something that would outlast him. This land was his legacy. Every morning for 4 years since retiring from the United States Geological Survey, I'd follow the same ritual. Tea on the back deck, watching morning fog drift through the pines, the scent of cedar sawdust from my workshop mingling with the sharp mineral smell of granite, the sound of woodpeckers echoing off that massive rock formation at dawn, my boots treading paths Marcus carved through solid stone in 1947. Helen, my wife of 31 years, runs the local historical society and has more patience than any human being should need, which she'd definitely require for what was approaching like a slow-motion ambulance. Our kids have scattered across the country pursuing their dreams. Rebecca's researching climate patterns at NOAA in Seattle. Daniel's designing sustainable architecture in Austin. Both inherited Marcus's appreciation for nature's engineering. What made our property extraordinary wasn't the 1965 A-frame cabin or my workshop crammed with half-restored Victorian furniture. It was that 300-ton granite outcrop with geological significance dating back 12,000 years, older than human civilization in North America, older than written language, and definitely older than suburban princesses with delusions of landscape architecture expertise. Then came Summit Ridge Estates, sprouting around us like invasive species after a forest fire. 63 homes, average price $1.3 million. Mostly Silicon Valley refugees, fleeing their own tech bubble disasters. The irony was thicker than morning fog rolling off the mountains. Enter our antagonist, Barbara Wellington, 54, HOA board president and self-appointed arbiter of mountain aesthetic perfection. Fresh from Beverly Hills, with that distinctive combination of wealth and willful ignorance that only comes from decades of having other people solve problems for you. Pearl white, Range Rover, vanity plates, reading designed, and those platinum earrings she wore like military decorations. Her husband's some venture capitalist who commutes to San Francisco 3 days a week. Kids attend boarding schools in Switzerland, where they probably learn that people like me represent quaint remnants of a pre-digital economy. Their $2.1 million contemporary villa perches on the hillside directly downslope from my property, floor-to-ceiling windows offering unobstructed views of what she considered my eyesore of natural rock. The first salvo arrived on a Wednesday morning that smelled like fresh brewed tea and incoming legal warfare. Official HOA violation notice. Certified mail with enough stamps to suggest they really wanted to make sure I got this message. Unsightly geological feature, visible from multiple properties, creates aesthetic disharmony with community vision. Immediate remediation required. Fine. $300 per day until compliance achieved. I read it 3 times while my tea went cold. The legal absurdity settling in my gut like bad seafood. Here's what Barbara's expensive attorneys. My property predates their HOA by 78 years. Marcus's deed included mineral rights, geological easement, and a grandfathered exemption from any future development restrictions that would alter natural land features. But they were gambling. This retired engineer wouldn't understand property law or wouldn't have the energy to fight back. The face-to-face meeting went exactly as you'd imagine. Barbara's office reeking of lavender essential oils and unearned confidence, she suggested with that practiced smile. Interior designers, perfect through years of convincing wealthy clients that beige is sophisticated, that I might be happier somewhere with more flexible aesthetic standards. Translation: somewhere poor people with natural rock formations belong. I responded with a certified letter explaining that HOA covenants don't supersede geological easements or property rights, established before 1950, basic real estate law. First thing they teach you when dealing with land that existed before suburbs did. Her retaliation was predictable and expensive. Anonymous complaints to the county about unsafe structures, because apparently a workshop built by a forest ranger looks suspicious to people who've never held a hammer. Building inspector spent 3 hours examining every beam and joint in Marcus's construction. Found nothing wrong except my filing system for furniture restoration projects. Still cost me $1,500 in legal fees, proving I wasn't operating a furniture smuggling operation or whatever Barbara's imagination had conjured. But that was just Barbara testing boundaries, literally and figuratively. The real catastrophe started when she discovered that my rock formation blocked her view of the valley and lowered her property value by, allegedly, creating an unsophisticated wilderness aesthetic. In Barbara's world, nature exists to be redesigned according to Architectural Digest standards, and people like me, with calloused hands and geological understanding, don't deserve to obstruct her vision. That's when I realized this wasn't about rocks or views or aesthetic harmony. This was about power, control, and someone who'd never been told no in her entire privileged existence. Spring snowmelt was running heavy that year, and the seasonal streams that fed through the rock formation were flowing stronger than usual. The sound of water percolating through granite fissures mixed with the scent of wet pine needles and morning mist rising from the forest floor. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it became the soundtrack to Barbara's next brilliant strategic maneuver. She'd done her homework this time, or thought she had, hired Pinnacle Land Development, a company that specialized in what they euphemistically called hillside aesthetic optimization, which is corporate speak for blowing up anything that doesn't photograph well in luxury real estate listings. Their strategy was elegant in its geological recklessness. File a nuisance land feature complaint with the county, claiming my rock formation created dangerous runoff patterns that threatened those precious million-dollar homes down. The legal papers arrived on a Monday morning, thick enough to stop bullets in about as subtle 73 pages of technical jargon that essentially said, make the old guy prove his 12,000-year-old rock isn't going to damage our clients' overpriced view platforms. They wanted to force me into a $65,000 geological impact study. You know, the kind that takes 18 months and requires hiring the same consultants who probably attend the same country club as their lawyers. Helen found me that evening, standing at the base of the granite outcrop, my hands pressed against stone that had witnessed the retreat of the last glaciers. "What are you thinking?" "Say, ask it," using that historical society curator voice. That meant she could sense trouble approaching like a distant avalanche. "I'm thinking Barbara's fancy lawyers just made a $65,000 miscalculation," I said, running my fingers over lichen that had been growing on this rock for centuries. "And I'm thinking they picked the wrong retired seismic engineer to challenge about geological stability. See, Here's something I learned during 35 years with the USGS. Lawyers love complicated environmental regulations because they assume regular people won't understand technical geological concepts. What they forget is that some of us actually spend our careers studying why mountains don't collapse and what happens when people remove the wrong rocks from the wrong places. I called my old colleague Sarah Chun at the California Geological Survey. Took her exactly 7 minutes to spot what Pinnacle Land Development had conveniently omitted from their analysis. They'd based their entire legal complaint on topographical surveys from before the interstate expansion was built upslope, before half the luxury developments higher in the mountains existed, before modern construction changed every natural drainage pattern in the entire watershed. Victor? Sarah laughed over the phone. These surveys show runoff patterns that haven't existed since Reagan was president. You want me to send the real geological data? This is going to be professionally embarrassing for them. The modern geological surveys told a completely different story that would make any geology student understand immediately. Far from causing problems, my granite outcrop actually prevented catastrophic slope failure by acting as a natural anchor point for the entire hillside. Those water channels Marcus had observed and documented, they weren't just decorative features. The old forest ranger had recognized a geological keystone before most engineers understood the concept. This rock wasn't just sitting there looking pretty or ugly, depending on your aesthetic preferences. It was literally holding the mountain together through a combination of mass, friction, and ancient geological processes that Barbara's interior design degree hadn't covered. But here's where geological engineering gets really fascinating. Back in graduate school, they taught us about something called keystone geology. Basically, certain natural features act as structural anchors that prevent slope failure across much larger areas than their physical footprint would suggest. Since my rock formation had been documented in geological surveys dating back to the 1930s, its structural role in hillside stability was established scientific fact, not aesthetic opinion. Barbara's entire subdivision, her HOA, and probably her grandchildren's future property values depended on that rock, staying exactly where it had been for the last 12,000 years. I spent that weekend in my workshop, surrounded by Marcus's forest ranger notebooks and modern county geological maps, connecting dots that Barbara's lawyers had either missed or deliberately ignored. The familiar smell of cedar shavings mixed with old paper, the scratch of pencil on tracing paper overlays, it felt like channeling the old man's spirit. And maybe his 1950s notes included observations about seasonal drainage patterns and slope stability that matched my own recent measurements perfectly. Uncle Marcus had understood this land better than any modern survey could capture. Monday morning, I filed my own complaint with the County Geological Review Board. Not just a defense, a comprehensive counterattack backed by 35 years of professional experience and peer-reviewed scientific data. I demanded that Barbara's HOA be required to conduct a proper slope stability assessment since their legal harassment was based on fraudulent, outdated surveys. Attached Sarah's analysis showing how their precious development actually increased slope failure risk for everyone. Downhill by concentrating runoff and removing natural vegetation. The County Geological Commissioner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Alvarez, who'd been dealing with hillside development disasters since before Barbara discovered California existed, took one look at my documentation and started making notes with the intensity of someone documenting a crime scene. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "these people just tried to lecture a USGS seismic engineer about slope stability using maps from the Carter administration. This might be the shortest geological dispute in county history. More importantly, if they actually remove this rock formation, I'll have to condemn every structure downslope as geologically unsafe. This rock isn't decorative. It's structural." 3 weeks later, complete vindication from every relevant authority. The county sided with me on every technical point, ordered the HOA to cease all harassment related to natural geological features, and officially validated my rock formation as a protected geological landmark with historical and structural significance. Suddenly, my granite wasn't just grandfathered property, it was carved into legal and scientific stone as essential infrastructure. But victory came with interesting social side effects that would prove crucial later. The local newspaper ran the story with the kind of headline that makes lawyers nervous. HOA challenges geological landmark, loses spectacularly to retired engineer. Neighbors I'd never met started appearing at my workshop door with their own Barbara horror stories that painted a disturbing pattern. Violations for non-conforming landscaping that deviated from approved plant species lists. Fines for unauthorized exterior lighting that wasn't recessed properly. Threats about inappropriate roof colors that created aesthetic discord with the community vision statement. That evening, Helen found me by the rock formation at sunset, Marcus's old field journal in my hands, reading his notes about how this granite had protected the mountainside through countless storms. "This is where he taught me about geology," I told her, "how stone that looks permanent can actually be the only thing preventing catastrophic failure. How removing one rock can cause an entire hillside to collapse. And where does this particular principle apply?" she asked, with that knowing look. I smiled, listening to water trickling through the granite channels that Marcus had mapped decades ago, running my calculations about slope angles, soil saturation, and what happens when you remove geological anchors from unstable terrain, right through the middle of her architectural showcase. You'd think losing a geological dispute would teach someone humility, or at least caution about challenging people who understand earth science. You'd be catastrophically wrong. HOA Stories, Part 2, The Demolition Barbara. Wellington had apparently graduated from the school of escalating bad decisions into worse ones. Because her next move was so audacious, it actually impressed me in a horrifying watching someone light dynamite while standing on a fault line kind of way. 4 weeks after the County Geological Commission told her to back off and respect protected landmarks, Barbara called an emergency HOA board meeting. Of course, she scheduled it during the 1 week Helen and I had planned a trip to Seattle to visit Rebecca and see our new climate research facility, our first real vacation since this geological warfare started. The meeting notice got delivered to an address we had moved from 6 years ago, ensuring we could not object to whatever fresh catastrophe she was engineering. The agenda item looked deceptively innocent enough if you did not understand geological terminology: emergency slope stabilization, assessment, and remediation. What actually happened was Barbara presenting doctored photographs showing severe erosion, damage allegedly caused by my rock formation. Pictures that looked suspiciously like they had been taken after someone had deliberately excavated soil around the granite outcrop with heavy machinery. She claimed her engineering consultant, a guy who turned out to be her husband's business partner with a degree in civil engineering from a correspondence school that probably advertised on matchbook covers, had determined that immediate rock removal was essential to prevent catastrophic hillside collapse. The irony was so thick, you could carve it with a jackhammer. She was claiming my geological anchor needed removal to prevent exactly the disaster that removing it would cause. The vote passed 9-2 with only Margaret Chun and Robert Kim objecting. Robert called me in Seattle that night, his voice shaking with anger that transcended his usual calm engineering professor demeanor. "Victor, this woman has lost her mind. She is claiming your rock formation is causing slope instability and needs immediate removal. She has photographs that look professionally staged, and she has convinced the board that we are all in imminent danger. She showed computer models that appeared to violate basic physics. Special assessment, $2,400 per homeowner for emergency geological stabilization services. Total project cost, $173,000 for what any actual geologist could have told them was geological suicide." But Barbara had found her justification, and suddenly every geological feature looked like a hazard that needed explosives. I cut our vacation short and drove home through the night, Helen sleeping fitfully in the passenger seat while I wiped the steering wheel and calculated how much irreversible damage they could accomplish in 96 hours. The answer, as it turned out, was catastrophic. The sound hit me first when we pulled onto our road at dawn. Not the gentle morning sounds of mountain wildlife and wind through pines, industrial generators growling where silence used to live. Then the smell, dynamite residue, mixing with pulverized ancient granite. Diesel exhaust hanging in the forest like a toxic fog, announcing the end of something irreplaceable. I rounded the corner to my driveway and witnessed what Barbara had done to 12,000 years of natural engineering. My rock formation was gone. In its place, a raw wound in the mountainside that looked like a bomb crater. That 300-ton granite outcrop that had anchored the hillside since the Ice Age, now reduced to rubble being hauled away in dump trucks. Clear drainage channels that Marcus had documented in the 1940s now destroyed, redirecting seasonal water flow directly toward the home's downslope. They had used shaped charges to fracture the granite into manageable pieces, destroying geological structures that had taken millennia to form. Bedrock that had supported the entire hillside now excavated down 6 feet, creating a massive destabilized zone right where slope stability mattered most. Helen stood beside me, tears streaming down her face as she watched them load another piece of our history into a dump truck. "They kill. It's she." Whisper. They actually destroyed something that survived the Ice Age. They murdered geology itself. But here is the thing about being a seismic engineer who spent 3.5 decades studying slope failures and mass wasting events. You learn to predict consequences with mathematical precision. And I could already calculate exactly what was going to happen to every structure downhill from this demolition site. I spent the next week documenting everything with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. Photographs from every angle showing the massive destabilized zone they had created. Soil samples for laboratory analysis of compaction and moisture content. Slope angle measurements proving they had steepened the grade beyond safe engineering limits. More importantly, I researched Pinnacle Land Development, the company that had done this geological butchery. Turns out they had quite the track record that would make any responsible engineer refuse to work with them. 4 EPA violations in 7 years, $135,000 in fines for unauthorized land modifications, and a pattern of starting demolition work before permits were approved. Because here is something every property owner should understand. Any significant alteration to hillside geology requires approval from the County Geological Review Board, the State Environmental Protection Agency, and often the USGS 4 sites with documented geological significance. It is like a legal 3-layer cake where you need permission for every layer before cutting into it. Barbara's crew had skipped all 3 layers and just started serving themselves. The Geological Resources Protection Act does not mess around when it comes to destroying documented geological landmarks. I had seen cases where violators faced $50,000 per day in fines at the federal level. California's geological protection statutes could add another $25,000 daily. The math was elegant and terrifying. Every day that destruction remained unremediated was another $75,000 in potential penalties. I filed complaints with every agency that had jurisdiction over hillside development and geological protection. County Geological Review Board, State Environmental Protection Division, the USGS Regional Office in Menlo Park. Then I called the California Geological Society, whose president, Dr. Raymond Foster, nearly had a seizure when I described what they had done to a documented Ice Age geological feature. "Mr. Reeves," he said, with the kind of fury that only comes from watching ignorance destroy irreplaceable natural heritage, "this is exactly the kind of geological vandalism we have been fighting for 30 years. We will provide whatever support you need. Legal representation, financial assistance, technical expert witnesses. These people just declared war on 12,000 years of natural history." The counterattack was swift and comprehensive, like an avalanche, gaining momentum. Within 12 days, I had 4 separate government agencies investigating the unauthorized demolition, an environmental law clinic from Stanford offering free legal representation, and enough documentation to bury Pinnacle Land Development and Barbara Wellington in their own geological rubble. But Barbara was not finished escalating. Robert Kim warned me she was already planning the next phase, a comprehensive hillside stabilization project that would involve the entire slope from the county road to the subdivision boundary using concrete retention walls. Her reasoning: if we are going to stabilize this hillside properly, we might as well engineer it correctly this time. The hubris was breathtaking. She had removed the natural geological anchor that had prevented slope failure for 12 millennia, and now she wanted to replace it with concrete and hope, the engineering equivalent of amputating a leg and replacing it with a wooden stick. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by Marcus's forest ranger notebooks, studying his 1940s photographs of the intact rock formation and the natural drainage patterns it had protected. The old forest ranger had documented something beautiful that worked perfectly for centuries, without human intervention. Barbara had destroyed it in 4 days with explosives and ignorance, but she had also just handed me enough federal violations and scientific evidence to put her in prison and bankrupt her subdivision. If you have ever wondered what desperation smells like mixed with essential oils and poor decisions, it is that distinctive combination you encounter in an interior designer's office at 6:30 in the morning. That is where I found myself 5 weeks later, sitting across from Barbara Wellington as she tried to convince me that destroying geological landmarks was actually landscape improvement. "Victor," she said, sliding a thick manila envelope across her glass desk with its view of the destruction site, "I think there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about our intentions. This whole situation has been regrettable but necessary." Inside the envelope, a cashier's check for $850,000 and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to build a retention wall from. The offer was simple and illegal as geological fraud. Take the money, agree never to discuss the rock removal situation publicly anywhere, and relocate outside the state within 9 months. Oh, and sign over any future claims related to slope stability or geological damage to the HOA for proper management by qualified professionals. The threat was barely disguised behind her designer's smile. Legal battles are expensive and exhausting. Victor, even when you win, you lose years of your life to court proceedings. Think about Helen's position with the Historical Society. Think about your retirement piece. Think about your property value if this becomes an extended legal nightmare. I had brought a small digital recorder, perfectly legal in California, with single-party consent laws, and Barbara's next words were pure prosecutorial gold that any district attorney would frame on their wall. "If you do not accept this generous offer, I will make sure every geological engineer and environmental consultant in this region knows you are an anti-development extremist who fabricates safety concerns to block legitimate improvements. My connections in the development industry go very deep, and Helen's Historical Society funding could become complicated. Grants have a way of disappearing when board members are married to troublemakers." That summer week, my workshop got vandalized for the second time. This time, they were not subtle about sending a message wrapped in property crime. Antique furniture pieces I had been restoring for 8 months were deliberately damaged with what looked like sledgehammer strikes, tools stolen, including some of Marcus's original surveying equipment that was irreplaceable. And my restored Victorian writing desk tipped over, legs deliberately broken, the mahogany veneer I had spent weeks repairing now destroyed, but they had made a critical tactical error. The upgraded security system I had installed after the first incident captured everything in high-definition color. 2 figures in hoodies, systematically destroying my life's hobby, followed by a pearl-white Range Rover with distinctive vanity plates picking them up at 2:37 in the morning. One of the vandals was wearing limited-edition sneakers that cost $700 and matched a pair I had seen on Barbara's 20-year-old son during a previous confrontation. The psychological warfare escalated into something that would make corporate espionage look friendly. Anonymous online reviews started appearing for Helen's Historical Society and consulting work, unprofessional conduct, political agenda, financially irresponsible management. Someone called the County Cultural Affairs Board with concerns about her fitness to manage historical preservation grants. The stress was eating at both of us in ways that felt designed to break our resistance. Helen losing sleep, me checking my blood pressure 3 times daily. But here is what Barbara fundamentally misunderstood about engineers and scientists. We are methodical about everything, including revenge. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint got documented with the precision of a federal investigation, because that is exactly what it was becoming. The USGS had opened a formal case file regarding destruction of a documented geological landmark. The California Attorney General's office sent investigators to examine the demolition site. Local geological societies were treating this like the environmental equivalent of burning down a historic library. And I was gathering allies faster than Barbara was making enemies and creating geological instability. Jennifer Martinez, a fourth-year environmental geology student at Stanford, had taken my case as her thesis project on geological landmark protection. She had discovered something fascinating while examining HOA financial records that Robert Kim had quietly provided, a pattern of inflated contracts with companies that had mysterious connections to Barbara's husband's venture capital network. "Mr. Reeves," she said, spreading documents across my workshop table with the excitement of someone who had just discovered fossil evidence. "This rock removal project cost $173,000 for work that should have been maybe $45,000 maximum if it should have been done at all. The excess went to consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums that all traced back to companies partially owned by Barbara's business associates and family members. She had found smoking guns where I had only suspected smoke and mirrors, board meetings held without proper notice, contracts approved without competitive bidding despite HOA bylaws requiring it, special assessments used to fund personal vendettas disguised as safety improvements. What started as geological destruction was looking more like organized fraud wrapped in environmental catastrophe. But the real revelation came from Marcus's old forest ranger records that I had been systematically reviewing. While researching the original geological documentation, I had found his 1976 consulting report for the county planning department, a document that predicted exactly what was happening now with mathematical precision. He had warned specifically against any removal of the granite outcrop, calculating that it would increase catastrophic slope failure risk by 420% during heavy rainfall seasons due to loss of bedrock anchoring and disruption of natural drainage patterns. The report included detailed topographical surveys, seasonal water table measurements, and soil composition analysis, everything Barbara's correspondence school consultant had ignored or never learned. More importantly, it proved that someone with actual geological credentials and decades of field experience had already studied this exact location 50 years ago and reached conclusions that were the opposite of Barbara's justifications. That is when I realized the beautiful and terrible irony of the situation that was unfolding like a slow-motion landslide. Barbara thought she was improving hillside aesthetics and property values by removing an ugly natural rock formation. But she had actually created a geological time bomb that was already ticking. Winter rains were 8 weeks away, and the missing rock anchor combined with the destabilized excavation zone was going to turn manageable seasonal runoff into a foundation-destroying mass-wasting event. The natural rock formation had distributed load and anchored soil across a wide area like nature's own retaining wall. The demolished zone created a massive failure plane aimed directly at the million-dollar homes down. I spent that weekend with my calculator, Marcus's slope stability charts, and current weather predictions from Rebecca's NOAA colleagues. The math was beautiful and horrifying in its precision. When the winter rains hit, and California's atmospheric rivers would hit hard that season, according to climate models, Barbara's demolition site would transform from stable bedrock to a slow-moving landslide. My property being upstream and still anchored on solid granite would remain stable. The HOA homes sit and downslope from the demolished anchor point were going to experience foundation movement measured in inches per day. Robert Kim stopped by that Sunday evening, finding me sketching geological cross-sections at my kitchen table with the kind of focus usually reserved for disaster prediction. "Victor," he said quietly, watching me plot failure planes and load distribution patterns, "Barbara is planning to start concrete retention wall construction next week." I looked at the Weather Service predictions showing heavy El Nino pattern forming in the Pacific, then at Marcus's calculations proving exactly what would happen when water met destabilized slope. "Robert," I said, "she just built the world's most expensive lawsuit and geological disaster. The mountain is going to reclaim what is hers with compound interest." HOA Stories Part 3. The Reckoning. The phone call came at 4:47 in the morning on November 9, 2024, jolting me awake with the particular urgency that meant someone's carefully constructed world was about to collapse. It was Robert Kim, whispering like he was documenting a crime scene from his kitchen window. "Victor, you need to see this. Barbara is loading her Range Rover with luggage, multiple suitcases. Middle of the night, evacuation. Something is very wrong with her property." I threw on clothes and drove past Barbara's house just as the first gray light was painting the mountains. Sure enough, a commercial moving truck sat in her circular driveway while she supervised the loading of expensive furniture with the franticness of someone fleeing an approaching disaster. The woman who had spent 8 months trying to destroy my property rights was apparently planning her own strategic retreat, but not before one final desperate legal maneuver that was either brilliant or completely delusional probably bought. Jennifer Martinez called 2 hours later with news that made my coffee taste like geological disaster. "Mr. Reeves, Barbara just filed for an emergency restraining order, claiming you have been stalking her family and making terrorist threats against OA property. She is asking for federal protection under domestic terrorism statutes and claiming you are planning to sabotage the hillside to prove your geological predictions correct." The legal papers were a masterpiece of creative fiction worthy of a suspense novelist. According to Barbara's sworn affidavit, I was a disgruntled retired engineer with documented paranoia issues, who had been conducting surveillance of HOA families and threatening to cause landslides through deliberate sabotage. She had even included photographs of me taking slope measurements as evidence of suspicious reconnaissance activity. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the same week that atmospheric river storms were forecast to hit California, a timing that was either coincidental or proof that Barbara understood exactly how catastrophically wrong her demolition project was about to prove itself. That afternoon brought the kind of coordination you would expect from a military disaster response operation if military operations involved environmental lawyers, forensic geologists, and very angry historical preservation societies. Kate Richardson arrived with a legal brief thick enough to anchor a hillside, while Dr. Patricia Alvarez brought real-time geological monitoring data that painted a terrifying picture of what was developing underground. "Victor," Kate said, spreading documents across my kitchen table with the intensity of someone building a prosecution case. "She is trying to tie up the legal system until after the rainy season. If she can get a restraining order keeping you away from the demolition site during the storms, there will be no expert witnesses to document what happens to those homes." The National Weather Service had upgraded their forecast to an atmospheric river warning. Multiple storm systems were converging on California during the worst possible timing for destabilized hillsides. Rainfall predictions suggested 6 to 9 inches in 48 hours, the kind of deluge that tests even stable geological formations. The demolition site was already showing signs of stress from normal autumn moisture, surface cracks appearing in the excavated zone, minor soil movement measured in millimeters per day, warning signs that any competent geologist would recognize as precursors to catastrophic failure. But Barbara had made one critical error in her final desperation play that would prove fatal to her legal strategy. The restraining order required her to appear in federal court and testify under oath about her surveillance accusations, which meant she would have to explain her claims, while prosecutors had recordings of her offering bribes and threatening witnesses. Agent Lisa Park from the FBI White-Collar Crime Division had been quietly building her case for weeks, following the money trail through Barbara's business network like a forensic accountant with a federal badge and unlimited subpoena power. The embezzlement charges were solid enough to build a prison sentence on. Nearly $200,000 stolen from homeowner assessments through fraudulent contracts and kickback schemes that would make organized crime look amateur. Add in the witness intimidation documented on my security recordings, the bribery attempts captured on audio, and the environmental crimes that violated multiple federal statutes, and Barbara was looking at serious federal prison time measured in years rather than months. The night before the hearing, I sat in my workshop examining Marcus's original geological surveys from not because I needed additional evidence, but because some rituals help you maintain perspective when watching someone destroy themselves through arrogance and ignorance. The demolition site was changing daily now as moisture infiltrated the destabilized soil. Autumn rains turning the excavated zone into something that resembled the early stages of mass wasting. Helen found me there at midnight with a flashlight, taking measurements in the darkness, like some geological detective documenting a crime before it fully manifests. "Tomorrow changes everything, does it not?" she asked, watching me record slope angles and moisture content. "One way or another," I said, listening to water percolating through soil that had lost its rock anchor, trying to find new pathways downhill. Either the legal system works or geology teaches the lesson that arrogance cannot override physics. The media attention had reached the kind of intensity usually reserved for natural disasters or corporate scandals that involve both environmental destruction and financial fraud. San Francisco news stations were planning live coverage of both the court hearing and the approaching storms. Environmental geology journals had turned my case into a symbol of what happens when HOAs override scientific expertise with aesthetic preferences. The hashtag geology wins eventually was trending regionally among earth science communities. Jennifer had discovered that Barbara's family had already purchased a house in Arizona and established residency there. Proof of premeditated flight before the legal and geological consequences hit. Bank records showed liquidated investments, closed accounts, and asset transfers designed to hide money from potential judgments and restitution orders. The woman was essentially fleeing multiple states, while accusing me of being a domestic terrorist who threatened community safety. Robert stopped by that evening with intelligence from what would be the final HOA board meeting before everything collapsed. Only Barbara and one remaining loyal ally had attended the meeting, while panicked homeowners demanded answers about geological stability, insurance coverage, and foundation warranty claims. Several families had already filed suit against the HOA for unauthorized modifications that voided their geological hazard insurance. Margaret Chun had formally resigned from the board with a letter that basically said, "I told you this was insane from the beginning." Victor Reeves said with the weariness of someone who had watched a preventable disaster unfold in slow motion. "This woman has made herself an enemy of everyone, including people who initially supported her aesthetic improvement project. They understand now she was lying to them about geological safety and stealing their money." The irony was perfect and terrible. Barbara had spent months trying to turn the community against me by portraying me as an anti-development extremist blocking progress, but her own greed, ignorance, and desperation had accomplished exactly the opposite. She had isolated herself so completely that even her former allies were distancing themselves from the legal and geological wreckage she had created. Tomorrow, federal court would decide whether environmental law and geological science could protect citizens from HOA tyranny wrapped in aesthetic preferences. But winter storms do not wait for legal decisions. Physics and geology were about to render their own verdict on concrete retention walls versus natural rock anchors. And geology, unlike Barbara, had never lost a case in 12,000 years. The federal courthouse in San Francisco was packed beyond fire code capacity on November 21st, with overflow crowds watching live streams. In the lobby while news crews fought for position outside, Judge William Chun, a man whose reputation for environmental law enforcement had made corporate developers break out in nervous sweats, presided over what local media had dubbed the Hillside Demolition Trial. Environmental groups filled half the gallery like spectators at a geological revenge opera. Engineering professional societies claimed another section wearing their organization badges, and local families who had been fighting their own HOA battles against unqualified board decisions occupied the rest. Outside, the first atmospheric river system was pushing inland from the Pacific, bringing the kind of rainfall that would test every geological prediction I had made. While inside, Barbara Wellington was about to learn that karma comes with compound interest calculated in slope angles and soil saturation rates. Kate Richardson's opening statement was surgical in its precision and devastating in its documentation. "Your Honor, this case represents the systematic destruction of a 12,000-year-old geological landmark to satisfy one woman's aesthetic preferences and personal vendetta against a neighbor who would not submit to her authority. The defendant did not just violate environmental protection laws and geological preservation statutes. She embezzled nearly $200,000 from her own community to fund this destruction while threatening and intimidating anyone who questioned her decisions." Barbara's lawyer, a nervous-looking partner from a development law firm that was probably reconsidering their client roster, tried to paint me as a radical environmentalist, blocking legitimate community improvements for ideological reasons. His voice cracked when he claimed the rock demolition was necessary slope stabilization approved by qualified contractors who understood hillside engineering. Then Kate played the recordings that I had collected over months of careful documentation. The courthouse went completely silent as Barbara's voice filled the room, offering bribes and threatening Helen's career and my reputation. You could hear gasps from the gallery when the secret HOA meeting recording revealed her true motivations that had nothing to do with geological safety, driving out incompatible residents who do not understand our community vision to boost property values for future development opportunities. Your Honor, Kate said with a kind of controlled fury that comes from representing someone who has been systematically victimized. The defendant's own words prove this was never about slope stabilization or community safety. This was about using HOA authority to conduct aesthetic and economic cleansing of longtime residents who did not fit her vision of luxury mountain living. My testimony was straightforward like a geological survey report. 35 years of seismic engineering experience, explained in terms that anyone could understand without a geology degree. I showed the judge Marcus's 1976 engineering report predicting exactly what would happen when you remove geological keystone features from unstable slopes. Computer animations demonstrated with terrifying clarity how the demolition had created a massive failure plane that would activate during heavy rainfall. The destroyed rock formation had distributed load across the entire hillside like a natural retaining wall that had worked perfectly for 12 millennia. But the real drama came when Dr. Alvarez presented real-time geological monitoring data that was updating every 15 minutes as the storm system approached. The demolition site was already showing measurable movement as soil saturation increased from pre-storm rainfall. Your Honor, Dr. Alvarez testified with the gravity of someone delivering a disaster warning. This demolished zone has created an imminent threat to public safety. During heavy rainfall conditions, which are occurring right now, according to Weather Radar, we are going to see catastrophic slope failure that will affect every structure downhill from the excavation site. Her testimony included soil mechanics, calculations, slope stability analysis, and predictions about failure timing that were so precise they felt like reading a countdown to disaster. The judge called a recess when the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for our specific area, and emergency management officials requested evacuation of properties in potential slide zones. Court officers began implementing emergency protocols, while county emergency response teams mobilized for hillside evacuations. When we reconvened 30 minutes later, Barbara looked like she had seen her own financial and legal future collapse in real time. Her lawyer was frantically checking his phone, probably getting updates from the geological disaster zone she had created through ignorance and arrogance. That is when Kate delivered the moment that every environmental lawyer dreams about. Your Honor, while we have been in session this morning, the demolished hillside has begun the catastrophic failure that every geologist predicted. Emergency crews are evacuating homes in Summit Ridge Estates as soil movement accelerates. Mr. Reeves's property upstream, and still anchored on solid bedrock, remains completely stable, while structures downslope are experiencing foundation displacement. Live television coverage from helicopter news crews confirmed the beautiful and terrible irony that physics always wins. Rainfall was saturating the destabilized zone, creating exactly the mass-wasting event that Marcus had predicted 50 years ago. The demolished area was transforming into a slow-motion landslide, moving downhill at rates measured in inches per hour. Million-dollar homes were experiencing foundation cracks, tilting walls, and structural damage as the hillside literally slid out from under them, while my property sat perfectly stable on the granite bedrock that Barbara had wanted to demolish for aesthetic reasons. Barbara's public meltdown was captured by every camera in the courthouse and would be replayed on news programs for weeks. She accused me of orchestrating the geological failure through sabotage, claimed environmental groups had somehow weaponized the weather and rainfall patterns, and demanded federal protection from what she called my Ikateris conspiracy to destroy property values. Judge Chun's patience evaporated like morning fog under harsh sunlight. Ms. Wellington, you will control yourself immediately or be held in contempt of this court. This tribunal has heard sufficient evidence. FBI agents served additional warrants during the lunch break, seizing financial records related to the ongoing racketeering investigation into HOA fraud and embezzlement. EPA criminal enforcement officers were simultaneously securing the demolition site as an environmental crime scene. California Attorney General investigators arrived with evidence of systematic HOA fraud affecting multiple developments across 3 counties where Barbara had connections. The afternoon session was almost academic after the morning's drama and the real-time geological disaster unfolding outside. Judge Chun ruled comprehensively in my favor on every single count. Geological Resources Protection Act violations, property rights infringement, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He ordered immediate emergency geological remediation at HOA expense, complete documentation of all damages, and awarded damages totaling $1.2 million, including attorney fees, expert witness costs, property devaluation compensation, and substantial punitive awards designed to deter future HOA overreach. More importantly, he established legal precedent protecting geological features and scientific expertise from HOA aesthetic preferences, creating a framework that other homeowners across the country could use to fight similar abuse. The press conference outside the courthouse felt like a victory celebration mixed with a disaster relief briefing. Environmental lawyers called it a landmark case that would reshape HOA law. Engineering societies presented me with professional recognition awards. Children from local schools who had been following the case gave Helen handmade cards, thanking us for protecting nature from destruction. But the real vindication was simpler and more profound than legal precedents or financial awards. That evening, as emergency crews evacuated residents from Barbara's tilting mansion while geological engineers prepared to begin hillside stabilization, that would cost millions. I stood on my back deck with Helen and listened to rain falling on granite that had weathered 12,000 years of storms. "Justice sounds like rainfall on bedrock," she said, watching water flow exactly where Marcus had documented it, flowing for decades. And for the first time in 8 months, that water was flowing around geological features that nature had placed there for very good reasons. "Physics always wins," I said quietly. "Always." HOA Stories, Part 4, The Restoration 9 months later. You would not recognize the hillside where Barbara Wellington had attempted to override 12,000 years of geological engineering with aesthetic preferences, and concrete where raw excavation wounds once scarred the mountainside. A carefully restored slope now demonstrates what happens when you let science guide reconstruction instead of ignoring it. The sound that wakes me every morning is not the harsh scrape of emergency hillside stabilization equipment. It is the gentle sound of water flowing through restored drainage channels that Marcus originated documented in 19... The restoration became a community effort that would have made my uncle proud and perhaps a bit amazed. Local geological engineering firms donated expertise and equipment time worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. University geology departments sent student teams to participate as educational and even some guilt-ridden former HOA members showed up with checkbooks and willingness to learn why you do not remove geological keystone features without understanding consequences. The smell of fresh earth mixed with mountain rain replaced the industrial stench of demolition and disaster. Helen and I spend our evenings walking the restored slopes, watching native vegetation that has been replanted take root in soil that remembers how to be stable. The texture of restored hillside under our boots, the sight of engineering students learning about natural slope stability where Arrogance once created catastrophe. It is better than Marcus ever imagined because it has been reborn through community education rather than one person's vision or destruction. The broader impact rippled outward like seismic waves from an earthquake epicenter. California's legislature passed what environmental groups nicknamed the Geological Heritage Protection Act, legislation strengthening property rights against HOA overreach and requiring professional geological review before any modifications to documented natural features. Law schools from Berkeley to Yale now teach the Wellington Hillside case as a model for protecting geological resources from unqualified decisions. Engineering ethics courses use it as a cautionary tale about what happens when aesthetics override physics. The financial justice was thorough and deeply satisfying in ways that transcend mere monetary compensation. That $1.2 million judgment funded the complete hillside restoration using proper geological engineering principles, paid all legal fees for multiple years of litigation, and left enough surplus to establish the Victor Reeves Geological Stewardship Fund at UC Berkeley. The first scholarship recipient was Jennifer Martinez, who had graduated with honors and joined the USGS Enforcement Division, carrying forward the fight against geological vandalism disguised as community improvement. Barbara's fate was almost poetic in its ironic justice after the dramatic courthouse confrontation and real-time disaster. She pleaded guilty to federal fraud and embezzlement charges and received 27 months in minimum security federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and complete restitution to all HOA victims she had defrauded. Her interior design credentials were permanently revoked by professional licensing boards. Her assets were seized through civil forfeiture to pay damages and restoration costs. And her family relocated to Arizona, where they live very quietly and avoid discussing their California adventure in mountain community destruction. The Pinnacle Land Development Company owner received 33 months federal prison time and $3.7 million in environmental fines for multiple violations across several states. For former HOA board members who had enabled Barbara's schemes got probation and community service requirements, spending their weekends restoring damaged geological sites throughout Northern California under professional supervision. Robert Kim was elected HOA president unanimously after the disaster and immediately implemented new bylaws requiring professional geological review for any future projects affecting natural land features. Margaret Chun became vice president and established an environmental oversight committee. But the real transformation was deeper and more meaningful than legal victories or financial settlements could measure. Summit Ridge had evolved from a gated community of suspicious strangers competing over aesthetic preferences into an actual neighborhood, where people knew each other's names and worked together on common problems grounded in science and mutual respect. The annual Geological Heritage Festival now draws thousands of visitors who come to see what grassroots environmental activism and scientific expertise can accomplish when ordinary people decide they have had enough of unqualified authority figures making catastrophic decisions. My workshop has returned to its original purpose of restoring antique furniture and teaching neighborhood kids about woodworking, geology, and the critical importance of standing up to bullies who confuse authority with expertise. The walls are covered with thank you letters from homeowners fighting similar battles across the country, requests for technical advice, and invitations to speak at environmental conferences and engineering ethics seminars. Helen returned to her historical society work with new curriculum incorporating geological heritage protection and citizen activism against unqualified Her programs on how communities can protect natural landmarks from development pressure have been adopted by historical preservation organizations nationwide. The Summit Ridge Geological Restoration Project has become a model replicated in dozens of communities where developers and HOAs have damaged natural geological features without understanding consequences. Federal agencies use our case study and training programs for environmental enforcement officers, showing how citizen expertise can accomplish what understaffed government agencies sometimes cannot manage alone. State geological surveys have created new landmark designation processes inspired by our legal victory, protecting significant geological features from aesthetic modifications by unqualified boards. Last week, I received a phone call from a homeowner in Colorado, facing nearly identical geological destruction by her HOA board. Ancient rock formations being demolished for view enhancement, unqualified consultants providing fraudulent safety assessments, homeowner funds being embezzled through inflated contracts. As I listened to a story that echoed my own experience so precisely, I realized this fight was bigger than one hillside in California. This was about protecting natural heritage from people who believe money and authority override scientific expertise and geological reality. Helen and I are now considering whether to help other communities facing similar battles. turning our workshop into a resource center for geological self-defense and scientific advocacy. We have been contacted by homeowners in 17 states, all facing HOAs that want to modify natural features without proper expertise. The demand for geological common sense apparently exceeds the supply of qualified decision-makers in many communities. But for now, it is enough to sit on the back deck at sunset, listening to water flowing through Marcus's restored drainage channels while Helen reads letters from supporters nationwide who have found hope in our story. The hillside that Barbara tried to destroy through arrogance and aesthetic preferences now stands as a living monument to what happens when you respect natural engineering instead of fighting it. Home is not just where your house sits on stable bedrock. It is where your values are protected, your scientific expertise is respected, and your community thrives through education rather than ignorance. So here is my challenge to you watching this story unfold. If you have got an HOA nightmare brewing in your neighborhood involving natural features or geological modifications, drop it in the comments below. You might be surprised how many legal and scientific options you actually have when petty tyrants with no expertise try to destroy something that has worked perfectly for thousands of years. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button, because next week we are covering the case of the HOA that tried to fill in a natural wetland for a golf course and the 76-year-old environmental scientist who fought back with the Clean Water Act and won. Sometimes the best revenge against bullies who confuse authority with expertise is patience, scientific documentation, and letting nature prove that physics always wins in the end. The insurance settlements told their own story about what happens when you ignore geological expertise. Every home in the slide zone faced policy cancellations or premium increases of 300 to 500%. Several families lost their properties entirely when foundation damage exceeded repair costs. Barbara's own mansion was condemned and demolished. The land value reduced to almost nothing because no insurance company would cover new construction on a documented slide zone. The property she had valued at $2.1 million sold for $175,000 to a geological research institution that uses it as a field study site for slope failure analysis. Real estate values throughout Summit Ridge plummeted initially, then recovered after the restoration project demonstrated that proper geological engineering could stabilize the hillside. Properties near my intact granite bedrock actually increased in value as buyers recognized the importance of natural geological stability. The restoration project itself became a master class in how to fix what ignorance destroys. Dr. Alvarez led a team of geological engineers who spent 8 months carefully rebuilding slope stability using techniques that mimicked natural geological processes rather than fighting them. They could not replace the 12,000-year-old granite outcrop that Barbara had demolished. That geological heritage was lost forever. But they could recreate the functional aspects using engineered rock anchors, proper drainage systems, and native vegetation that held soil in place. The project costs $4.3 million, paid entirely through insurance settlements, HOA assessments on properties that had benefited from Barbara's fraud, and federal environmental restoration grants. Every penny was worth it to prevent future catastrophic failures and restore some measure of stability to the hillside. Educational components were built into the restoration from the beginning. Interpretive signs explain why the original rock formation was geologically significant and what happens when you remove keystone features. Student groups regularly visit to see successful slope stabilization and learn from mistakes that cost millions to fix. The site has become an outdoor classroom where future engineers and geologists learn that nature's engineering often exceeds human capabilities. When you understand it, rather than destroy it, Dr. Raymond Foster from the California Geological Society personally led several university field trips to the restored hillside, using it to teach about geological heritage protection and the consequences of ignoring scientific expertise. His students interviewed Helen and me ostensibly, documenting our fight as a case study in citizen science advocacy and environmental protection through individual action. Marcus would have appreciated the irony that his simple forest ranger observations from the 1940s became the foundation for modern geological restoration techniques and legal precedents protecting natural features. His notebooks are now archived at the UC Berkeley Geological Library. available to researchers studying historical geological documentation and long-term slope stability. The legal precedents established through our case have already been cited in 47 subsequent lawsuits across 12 states. HOAs attempting to modify natural geological features now face much higher legal barriers and liability exposure. Several proposed rock removal projects were abandoned after attorneys cited the Wellington case and its massive financial consequences. Insurance companies now require professional geological assessments before covering any hillside modifications, making it much harder for unqualified board members to approve destructive projects. The California Association of HOAs revised their model bylaws to require professional expertise for any project affecting natural land features. They now recommend that boards consult qualified geologists before making decisions that could affect slope stability, explicitly citing our case. As the reason for these changes, professional geological societies have established certification programs for HOA consultants, trying to prevent future barbarists from hiring unqualified friends to provide fraudulent safety assessments. The personal toll of fighting this battle for 8 months was significant in ways that money cannot fully compensate. Helen and I both experienced stress-related health issues that required medical attention. Our retirement plans were disrupted for nearly a year while we fought legal battles. Friendships in the community were tested and some did not survive the controversy, but we also gained something valuable through this struggle. A deep appreciation for the importance of standing up for scientific truth against ignorant authority, connections with environmental and geological communities we never knew existed, and the satisfaction of knowing we protected something irreplaceable from destruction. Most importantly, we prevented future families from experiencing what we went through by establishing legal protections and educational frameworks that will outlast us. Sometimes standing up to bullies who confuse authority with expertise requires sacrificing your peace temporarily to protect something permanent. The restored hillside is not just geology and engineering. It is a statement that ordinary people with scientific knowledge can prevail against wealthy opponents who believe money and authority override physics and expertise. As I write this final reflection sitting in my workshop, surrounded by Marcus's notebooks and my restored antique furniture, I can hear water flowing through the restored drainage channels exactly where my uncle documented it flowing 77 years ago. That sound represents continuity, stability, and respect for natural processes that work when you understand them rather than destroy them. Barbara Wellington tried to reshape a mountain to match her aesthetic preferences. The mountain responded by teaching a 12,000-year-old lesson about why you do not remove geological anchors from unstable slopes. Physics always wins. Geology always gets the last word. And sometimes, the best way to fight ignorance, wrapped in authority, is patience, documentation, and letting nature prove your point with catastrophic clarity. We appreciate you spending your time with us on HOA Stories, where HOA tyrants finally get checked by reality. If you enjoyed today's geological justice, hit like, comment on your favorite part below, and do not forget to subscribe so you will be the first to catch our next HOA showdown where nature reminds humans that some things should not be modified for aesthetic reasons.